Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. The Iowa History 101 series continues through the end of the year, addressing the Great War and winter holidays. But today we are learning about some of Glendale Cemetery's famous and not so famous inhabitants. You can learn more about this series and our other programs on our website at iowaculture.gov/history. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Kate Levasseur. Kate is a local historian who is a fifth-generation Des Moines native, and her love of history started at home as a child. While a history student at Drake University, she completed 2 internships in museum education and collections. These internships sparked an interest in educating people about history through storytelling and historic objects. She has worked at Living History Farms in Urbandale and is currently managing a museum in Des Moines and enjoys learning more about local history wherever she can. Now I'm happy to turn the webinar over to Kate.
Thanks, Jennifer. All right, so I want to take a moment to welcome everyone to our presentation today about Glendale Cemetery. And a special welcome to anyone that was able to join us back in April for my first presentation about Woodland Cemetery. So this is just another chance to be able to learn a little bit more about some of the past residents of Des Moines. Like Jennifer said, some famous and some not so famous, just to get their stories out. And that is me, just so we have a little bit of a visual. Under normal circumstances, I would have loved to do this in person, but here we are. I'm so glad to be able to share with you today. A little bit about Glendale Cemetery itself. This history of the cemetery itself isn't my focus today, but just so you have a little bit of contextual information, 190 acres of land was purchased from Ebenezer Ingersoll in 1896. Originally, though, it was considered too remote for a cemetery, which of course, to those of us that spend time in Des Moines today, that's kind of funny, since now we wouldn't necessarily consider that the case. But it was some time before the first burial occurred. It wasn't until 1904. Initially, Glendale Cemetery was named Woodlawn Cemetery, but the name was changed at the request of then Mayor James Brenton to honor his mother, whose maiden name was Glenn. There are some newspaper articles about the name change there, and Mayor Brenton said it was a sentimental choice. So I don't know if that's how I would prefer to be memorialized, but that is the origin of the name Glendale. Currently, the cemetery is 176 acres and it has over 100,000 burials. And before we really dive in to get started on any of the stories, I just wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about how I selected the stories that I will be sharing today. Like many of the people on this call are people that have lived in Des Moines for multiple generations. I have family buried, several generations of my family buried in Glendale Cemetery. And I'm sure that some of you may be wondering what my criteria was, because some of you may have relatives that have excellent stories that are buried in the cemetery as well. And for the more well-known occupants, if you will, I chose those names because of name recognition. So there was the chance that, you know, people would maybe have heard of these names or know a little bit about them. So that was a chance to give you some information about some famous people, or at least locally famous people. And then I also have a selection of people that you probably don't know their names. And the criteria for that was, I found something interesting about the story. I just happened to see that name when I was going through for a walk in the cemetery or doing some research. And if your ancestor is not in the presentation, I promise their story is still interesting, still worthwhile. There are a lot of stories that didn't get a chance to be included. So please don't take it personally if your ancestor is not in the presentation today. With over 100,000 stories to tell, we only have an hour. So we'll start here at the very beginning, as they say. Mrs. Thomas Cubit was actually the first burial in Glendale Cemetery in 1904. So she is buried in block 14, section 56, lot 1. Now, if we were actually in person at the cemetery, we would be standing next to the stone and we'd be able to have that experience. And actually, I will be including pictures of the stones, but there is actually no stone for Mrs. Cubit. I have included the block section numbers where I found them, or lot numbers, and we will be sending out a map in the next couple of days. So if you want to go have your own walking tour, see where any of these stones are, you can use that information. The way the sizing was on the map, I didn't include it just because it was too small to really see. So if you do want to go visit these places, you will be able to do that. Mrs. Cubit died from what the newspapers of the day referred to as dropsical trouble. We would now call it edema. Some other articles said heart disease as well, so it kind of ties in there. For whatever reason, the story of her death was actually featured in newspapers around the state of Iowa due to a series of Cubit family misfortunes. For example, their eldest son was playing in the yard with a friend, and they basically created a small bomb on accident. And when it exploded, the neighbor boy actually was blinded, and the Cubit boy sustained injuries as well, but ended up recovering. So as you can imagine, that was of some interest to the paper. And some of these newspaper articles about Mrs. Cubit's death were sensationalized. So you can see there, I've included a clip from the Quad City Times that says, Mrs. Thomas Cubit of Des Moines was found dead in her bed. She had a mysterious illness. There are suggestions of death by design by some person. So though her death was ruled to be of natural causes, again, from dropsical trouble, heart problems, there was, for some reason, floating around some stories that there may have been something else to it. The next person we'll be talking about is one of our famous people. Henry A. Wallace was born in 1888 and died in 1965. As you can see from his headstone, he was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Vice President of the United States, and the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. He's buried in block 31, lot 25. Now, for those of you that are more knowledgeable about Henry Wallace, we won't have time to go into a full biography, and there is a lot of information. So to hit on some of the highlights here, Henry Wallace was born on the family farm near Orient, Iowa in Adair County in 1888. His family did not stay on that farm for his entire life. He actually moved to both Ames and Des Moines as a child. And in 1904, he was showing an interest in different sorts of crops and agriculture, education, and information, and he actually devised an experiment that disproved the theory that aesthetically pleasing corn produced the highest yield. So that was kind of one of his first big contributions. After he graduated from Iowa State University in 1910, he became a full-time writer and editor for his family's publication, Wallace's Farmer. He and his wife purchased a farm where he expanded on his interest in corn, and he developed a hybrid copper cross and reached a contract for producing that hybrid in 1923. He co-founded Hybrid Corn Company in 1926. So for those of you unfamiliar, that's now Pioneer. He was appointed Secretary of Agriculture by Franklin Roosevelt after the 1932 election. So throughout World War I and the 1920s, both Henry A. Wallace and his father, also named Henry Wallace, had a lot of contributions in terms of trying to figure out how to increase hog production, different ways to work on increasing corn yields to help both the war effort and people that needed that food. And he was often at odds with the president or the administration, including Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. So he actually backed Franklin Roosevelt, despite the fact that the family had been associated with the Republican Party in the past. As a Democrat, obviously Franklin Roosevelt was on the opposite side of the aisle from what they had done, but he was a follower of some of the same philosophies. So Henry Wallace ended up supporting Franklin Roosevelt and then was appointed Secretary of Agriculture. And then for Roosevelt's third term, he appointed Henry Wallace vice president. And then Henry Wallace continued to have roles in the federal government, the Secretary of Commerce into the late 1940s. And after that, there was some controversy for what was seen as his support, or maybe not support, but for not being as against the Soviet Union as some other people thought he should be, which was, amongst other things, something that led him to kind of back off from being in public life in the way that he had to that point. So he stepped back, went back into working with agriculture, and in 1964, he was diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, and tried a lot of experimental treatments. He decided he could be, in his words, kind of a guinea pig for treatment, but he did end up passing away in 1965. At that point, he and his wife were not living in Iowa, but his remains were brought back and buried in Woodlands, or excuse me, Glendale. I guess I'm thinking about our presentation this spring, but in Glendale. Our next story is going to be a couple that is not famous, but I did enjoy the story when I did some research after looking them up and seeing their stone on a walk. So this was Morrison and Addie Asbury, and theirs is just going to be a shorter story, so I don't have a separate slide. But Morrison was a violin instructor here in Des Moines, and he was born in 1856, and he had a violin school in town as well as an orchestra that would play different shows. And once you got into the 1890s, you start seeing advertisements for his trio that he was in with two ladies who were sisters, and their names were Addie and Ida Pearsall. And he actually ended up marrying Addie, and she was also a violinist, and they were 49 and 44 when they got married. He was 49 and she was 44, and it was her first marriage and his second. So I thought it was kind of a nice story that they ended up finding love and getting together after meeting and working together with such a common interest. And excuse me. She came from an interesting family as well. Her parents were both born in New York, and they moved to Iowa fairly early, not Des Moines, but to Iowa. And then in the 1890s, her father actually ran an extract business in Des Moines. And this was before the Fair Food and Drug Act was enacted. So he actually had several patents for different extract formulas. They tended to be a little higher in alcohol, but he had a patent on a lemon extract that became very popular. And they had 6 daughters. So Addie was one of 5, had 5 sisters. And at the time of their father's death in 1902, this was before Addie had gotten married, 4 of the daughters were unmarried and living in the family home with their parents. And the eldest daughter actually helped her dad at the extract shop. So I thought that was just an interesting story for both, women in the business world and for this couple, Morrison and Addie. Our next story is one that has a lot of interesting details. James B. Morris was born in 1890 and died in 1977. He was buried in Block 25, Lot 188. Excuse me, my allergies have been acting up. James Morris was born in Georgia in 1890. He attended Hampton Institute in Virginia and received his law degree from Howard University in Washington, D.C. He came to Des Moines in 1916 and was admitted to the Iowa bar the following year. After the U.S. entered World War I, Morris joined the first all-Black officer training class at Fort Des Moines and served 2 years in Army intelligence as well as 10 months overseas. In 1922, after coming back from the war and spending a couple years practicing law, he purchased the Iowa Bystander, which is Iowa's oldest Black newspaper, and acted as editor and publisher until 1972. He also helped found the Negro Bar Association, now known as the National Bar Association, in 1925. His wife, Georgine, was also a very impressive woman. She founded the Iowa State Conference of the NAACP in 1939, and James was a charter member and served as president of that organization. He worked on many civil rights cases involving housing, employment, and public facilities as a member of the Legal Redress Committee of the Iowa State Conference of the NAACP. He also received awards recognizing his work in the community from many organizations, including the Des Moines Human Rights Commission, the Veterans Administration, and the National Bar Association, again, among many others. The next is not so much a person as a controversy that happened. So the Mariah Hickman controversy. Mariah Hickman was originally from St. Joseph, Missouri, and she died in 1909 at the home of her daughter here in Des Moines after an illness of about 8 weeks. Her obituary, which was published in the Bystander, described her as, it said, "Thus a good woman, a true mother, and an exemplary Christian has gone from us." Now the controversy arose when her sons bought a plot in Glendale Cemetery, but upon learning that they weren't white, the sexton of the cemetery dug a grave in a different part of the cemetery. And according to the Bystander, which, as you may recall, it was the African-American newspaper, they said that their reporters had heard of this sort of thing happening before. So they said there was a colored line in the cemetery, according to the newspaper article. So the superintendent of public parks, Leslie Ash, actually stepped in and forced cemetery authorities to bury the body in the original grave. And that's a direct quote taken from the Bystander in August 13th, 1909. Now, the next story is Herman E Hollis, who went by, or Ed, who was born in 1903 and passed away in 1934. Buried in Block B, Lot 64. Ed Hollis was born in Des Moines in 1903, and he attended Georgetown University School of Law and joined the FBI after graduation in 1927. And with the FBI, he quickly became a top investigator and also earned a sharpshooter status for his work with the Thompson submachine gun, or a Tommy gun, as you may hear in more popular terms. He was actually one of 3 agents that participated in a shootout with gangster John Dillinger in Chicago in July 1934. And that shootout ended in Dillinger's death. All 3 agents fired at the same time, so that it's not known which one of them was officially responsible for his death, but all 3 agents were commended. Additionally, he was one of 2 agents that engaged Babyface Nelson in the Battle of Barrington in October 1934. So anyone that is familiar with kind of this gangster time period in the 1930s, both John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson were pretty significant names. And the Battle of Barrington was actually the shootout in which Babyface Nelson was killed. And unfortunately, Ed Hollis was also killed in that shootout. After his death, he became a member of the FBI Hall of Fame. And there are a handful of baseball players in the cemetery. So I've picked a couple here. We have Arthur Ewalt. He was born in 1894, passed away in 1977. And he's buried in Block F, Lot 38. And Arthur Ewalt was born in northwestern Iowa, and a lot of his career was spent in the minor leagues. Here in Des Moines, he played for the Des Moines Demons, but he was in minor league ball for about 15 seasons. He did have a brief stint as an infielder for the Philadelphia Athletics in 1919. But as you can see from his stone, he did serve in World War I, which would have, been about in that same time period as his early baseball career. The other baseball player that I have here for you is named Charlie Dexter. He was born in 1876 and died in 1934. And he is buried in Block B, Lot 3. And I didn't find Charlie or Charles Dexter when I was searching for baseball players. One of the first trips I made to Glendale Cemetery to get ideas for some of the less famous people, I just wrote down or took pictures of a lot of the mausoleums that I saw, and thinking that perhaps the person that was wealthy enough to have a mausoleum would maybe have an interesting story just as a starting point. And so actually how I connected into the story was there was a doctor, and this doctor was in the newspaper, the Des Moines Register, because he had treated a stabbing victim. And Charlie Dexter's name popped up because he was the person that did the stabbing. And so in 1905, he was playing for the Des Moines baseball team, and the Milwaukee baseball team had come down for a series of games. And a lot of these guys knew each other, the baseball players, they were friends. And so they all decided to basically go out and enjoy several area establishments after the game. And something happened, some sort of fight broke out between Charles Dexter and this other gentleman, and Charles Dexter stabbed him. And there were articles in newspapers all over the country. And again, some were very sensationalized. Some said that the his victim was already dead. Some said that they were all highly intoxicated and that a fight broke out. And some of them said it wasn't that bad of a stabbing and he would be recovering after getting stitches and having some time to rest. So I couldn't find anything that said for sure where in the spread of that it happened, except that his victim did not die right away. But Charles Dexter actually did end up staying in Des Moines for several years after this stabbing. He ended up owning a restaurant called Antlers Restaurant. But sadly, he died in 1934 in Cedar Rapids at the Pullman Hotel by committing suicide. He had checked in the hotel under a false name. And while they found several letters in his belongings, they were unable to find a note or any other information, but they did find information that connected him back to the restaurant that he owned and to Des Moines. So unfortunately, there are some mysteries there still in that case. Next up is William Campbell. And William Campbell is a Medal of Honor recipient and from the Civil War, as you can see on his stone. He was born in 1840 and died in 1919. He's buried in Block 15 and Lot 58. And I will add too that William Campbell is not the only Medal of Honor recipient buried in Glendale. There are a few others, but since this wasn't specifically a military themed presentation, I wanted to make sure we had a variety of stories. But it is pretty easy to look up to see some of the other famous people buried in Glendale Cemetery, both through the findagrave.com, if you've ever been to that website, or through some other sites affiliated with Des Moines or the Des Moines Parks Department. But there's a nice Victorian photo of William Campbell. He must have had very light colored eyes, but he was actually born in Ireland in 1840. And he immigrated to the United States with his parents in 1846. He ended up in Ohio, and in the Civil War, he served as a member of the 30th Ohio Infantry. There weren't a lot of newspaper stories about Mr. Campbell, but from census records, I found out that he did move to Iowa by the 1870s. So not long after the Civil War. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor for gallantry during the siege of Vicksburg, specifically for his actions on May 22nd of 1863. Those of you that are familiar with the siege of Vicksburg, it was not a battle per se. It took place over several weeks because it was a siege of a fortified city. So what William Campbell did in order to be awarded the Medal of Honor was he was one of 150 volunteers that served at least for this particular action under General William Tecumseh Sherman to lead the way with ladders and planks. So the idea was they called it a forlorn hope detachment because the idea was there's a very high risk that these 150 volunteers would not survive this particular action. And so they had ladders, they had different planks to go over a ditch in hopes that this would give the rest of the troops the ability to get more footing to get up to the town itself. He did survive, luckily, and I don't have statistics about how many of those men perished, but luckily for William Campbell, he did make it. And he did not receive his Medal of Honor right away. According to the Des Moines Register, he received a letter during Grover Cleveland's second administration. So that would be in the 1890s. And the quote from the paper says, when asked if he had ever been awarded a medal for his bravery in the war, Mr. Campbell answered and stated all he received was a cut in his pension from $12 to $8 a month. So I think he definitely had a sense of humor. And later on into the 20th century, you don't want to get me started about Civil War pensions. It was something I studied in college and I can go on about it, but he was added to an honor roll for the Army and Navy Medal of Honor recipients. And that did earn him an extra $10 a pension in recognition for his achievements. So he did end up getting a pension increase. Now, I did go through that a little more quickly because I thought there might be a few more questions. I do have a couple other stories in my back pocket, but I'm happy to address any questions that we've had so far.
Thank you, Kate. So so we had some time to answer some questions. However, before I pose our first question, I want to remind our participants that you can still submit your questions to the Q&A feature right there on your screen there. But we are on a schedule, so we may not be able to get to all the questions given. There's so many great stories to tell. So Kate, I know we've talked about this in the past. We've exchanged some stories. But my first question to pose to you is, did you come across any interesting stories during your presentation and your research for the presentation that you want to tell that just didn't fit in today?
Yes, and I wasn't quite sure how the timing would work out, and so I didn't include this one, but this one is one of my favorite stories from Glendale Cemetery, and it's actually one that I knew or had looked up prior to preparing for this presentation. And the couple in question, I was walking with my dog in the cemetery, and we walked by the Bean Blossom family, and never make fun of anyone's last name, but that's an unusual last name. So I looked up to see if I could find out anything about the Bean Blossoms. And it was actually quite hilarious because this would have been in the 19-teens, and Mr. and Mrs. Bean Blossom ended up spending part of their winter in California. And while they were there, they had purchased 2 automobiles and they were planning on driving them back to Iowa. And the problem was that Mr. Bean Blossom, his glasses weren't working very well. And this would have been quite a trip from California to Iowa. So they were on some pretty rough roads, but since they had 2 vehicles, they each had to drive one. So the solution was that they were going to tie a big red flag to the back of Mrs. Bean Blossom's car, and then Mr. Bean Blossom would follow that red flag, and that's how they would both successfully make it back to Iowa. And unfortunately, at one point, the road got really rough, and Mrs. Bean Blossom ended up going off the road into a ditch, and unfortunately, Mr. Bean Blossom followed. So the 2 of them both had to wait for help to get their vehicles out of the ditch and back on the road. But I just appreciated the visual of a car with a big red flag at the back of it making its way through the American West in the teens.
So this actually kind of touches on the idea of that story about how you notice a stone. So what is it about stones as you walk through a cemetery that drew you into research the deceased? And this is a question from Marty. So thank you, Marty.
I wish there was kind of a more scientific or academic answer, but a lot of the times I will just be looking around, and if the stone is unusual in some way, if the name is unusual in some way, that tends to draw attention. So it's somewhat arbitrary, and that was one of the things about this presentation that was different than my woodland presentation, which was very guided. We were focusing on women. A lot of them were Victorian women. So I had a pretty open slate for this one, and with 100,000 people, I'm sure there's some really interesting ones I missed, but I had to start somewhere. So it was interesting sounding names or interesting looking stones for those first couple walks that got me started.
Well, continuing with that storyline of interesting stones, what is the most unique or interesting gravestone that you have come across so far?
That is a fun question because there are so many interesting stones in Glendale. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a very wide time period and there are different sections of the cemetery in addition to military sections, sections for infants like we talked about, like that are at Woodland. There's also several different sections at Glendale from the Victorian era. Well, actually the Edwardian, I guess, since the first burial wasn't until 1904. So up into the present day. So you also have a Taidam section of the cemetery, an Islamic section of the cemetery. There's a Catholic section of the cemetery. There is a Jewish section of the cemetery and the Masonic cemetery attached, but since they aren't, they're private, I did not include them as options for the storytelling today. But across, actually from my family, my ancestors' graves is a giant angel. It's a life-size angel statue, and she's holding a kind of a scrolled, it's still made out of stone that has the person's name on it. And that has become known in my family as the creepy angel. And then there's one that's 4 columns and kind of like an urn. And it's the stone itself. I don't believe there are remains in it, but they're just very architectural and they're art compared to, just a piece of stone, which is perfectly fine. But we always were able to use those as landmarks when I was growing up, just because they were so interesting and unique.
Yeah, really quick before we move to the next question, someone did ask about the web address for the map of the cemetery, and that will be included in the thank you email that goes out tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that to see that map that Kate mentioned and Jennifer did too. But about stones, someone also mentioned, Beth asked a question about the symbolism of stones within the graveyard. Have you done any research on that?
I not particularly, just based on, you and I have our experience with Victorian symbolism. So not to keep talking about Woodland, but since those stones are so specific to a time, you saw lots of symbolism, like the stones that are shaped like beds for children, stones that look like trees, for example. And you do see some of that still in Glendale, but otherwise a lot of the symbolism you see on the stones would be markers for, say, the Masons or the Oddfellows. So fraternal groups, their sister groups for women that they would be part of. So a lot of it was denoting membership in different groups that they wanted to be included. But otherwise, beyond that, I haven't done a whole lot of research.
One question that came up about the story told about the Bean Blossom family. Could you spell that last name?
It's actually just as it sounds. It's BeanBlossom.
Thank you. And you.
May. There's a few of them. There's a few Bean Blossoms. Sorry, Matt. So this particular story, I know the wife's name was Rena May, and the husband, I believe, it's Alfred or Albert. But yeah, the Bean Blossoms.
One good question about Glendale Cemetery is, do you have any recommendations about walking through Glendale, which I know you do regularly? I get messages from you as you do it. Like, what's the best section to begin in?
Honestly, it all kind of depends on what you want to see, if that makes sense. To me personally, just speaking from my own experience, I find the older parts of the cemetery to be a little more, I don't want to say atmospheric exactly, but it's going to feel less like just a cemetery that has flat stones, or, more modern stones. So that is the more southeastern part of the cemetery, close to the entrance on University. The Masonic Cemetery is over on the east side as well. So that kind of that southeast corner is usually where I start. But the walk, especially towards the northwest corner, which is where there's a lot of military stones, and that the tie dam section is really, it's flatter and it's a little more park-like. So it just kind of depends on what you want to see. I usually start in the older section of the cemetery and kind of go west.
So another question that came across is about your research and any recommendations for people starting their research, their family history, or people they find like you do during a cemetery visit where you like the stone and you want to know more about them. So any recommendations for how to start that research?
Yes, and I will say that since this is something that I'm very passionate about, I have no problem paying for ancestry.com, newspapers.com. So resources like that. So that is what I use. But just in a general sense, I use the newspaper, digital archives, and things like census records, and even city directories are very helpful. That came up when I was researching that Pearsall family, because the daughters, they had different professions. So it was interesting to see where they were listed as living, and what jobs they had, which was something I could find in the city directories. So those are the sources that I use, and many of those resources do have free trials. So it's a good starting point if you want to see. Otherwise, public libraries, of course, are going to have records. Librarians are fantastic resources for especially local information like that. So especially if your family is here in Des Moines, and they're in Glendale, they're buried in Glendale, I would definitely recommend the Des Moines Public Library as a good resource as well.
And really quick, another resource that's fantastic. So Leo Landis put this in the chat. So Leo Landis, our state curator, he mentioned that former state historian Lauren Horton and Iowa historian Michael Zaz have a great book released in 2018 called Grave Marker Symbols, a Field Guide. So for our people joining us today who were asking about stones and how they look, that might be a nice place to start. Look there too.
I will add, that makes me think again, findagrave.com. And I know it's kind of like a weird sounding website to go to, but it's a free resource. And you can even just go to the Glendale section of Find a Grave, and you can look around through there. That they do have famous burials as a separate section. Or you can look at a lot of different cemeteries. You can look people up in your family by name and find out where they're buried. So that's a great free resource online as well.
And I know there was a story that you mentioned to me a while back that didn't come up today about a haunted house that I think is kind of fascinating. Do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, I figured I was trying to find something that would be spooky, since it was, we're getting close to Halloween, and you told me this would be a program before Halloween. And so I was looking for any good ghost stories or haunted house stories that could be corroborated, if you will, not necessarily to their truthfulness, but just that they were in the newspaper or recorded somewhere else. And in 1874, there was a lot of newspaper stories in the spring about a haunted house that was reported as being both on the north side of town and the east side of town. So I guess maybe it just depended on who it was that was talking. But it was a house and a stable. So I assume, where the family would have kept their horses. And apparently it was the site of some apparitions, some knocking, manifestations like that. And there was a family that was living there at the time, and the story got out that this house was haunted. And the family were having visitors all the time. According to the paper, at one point, there were over 1,000 people that showed up to try to catch some of this haunted action, to hear the banging and to see a ghost. And at one point, they had a fire in the stable because there were some tricksters. It was blamed on youths, but who knows, that had brought some phosphorus to try to create their own apparition, but it ended up almost setting it on fire. So that family ended up moving out just because they were so scared, and also were sick of having random people show up in their yard. And even when a new occupant moved into the house, people still kept showing up. So finally, the gentleman that started renting the house called in backup, if you will. Had a priest, had different sort of people come in, and allegedly it calmed it all down. But they had stories about this haunted house appearing in the Mason City paper, the Council Bluffs paper, the Davenport paper. So it made it all over the state. But just the thought of having 1,000 people show up in your yard when you're trying to get some sleep anyway, I thought that was a pretty interesting story. And I was trying to connect it to Glendale in some way, maybe through some police officers that ended up having to patrol the property to make sure that none of these visitors were causing property destruction. And I couldn't connect it to Glendale. But it was a really crazy story to think about, and how these people all found out about it, without the internet or television, just using word of mouth and the newspaper there to figure it out that it was happening. So if anyone wants to find out more information about it, it was March or April of 1874. You can use the newspapers.com account if you had one, or other digital newspaper depositories, to find out all about the bumps in the night that were taking place in Des Moines in 1874.
It's perfect timing for that this time of year. So Kate, let's have our last question. And this is a pretty open question for you. But during your research, I know you love to do research. What was the most surprising thing that you found out or you discovered?
I think it wasn't so much, well, I think I will say some of the parts of the cemetery I had not spent a lot of time in before. So it really just hit home how large for Des Moines, how large the cemetery was. And I also really enjoyed learning a little bit about the Ty Dom section of the cemetery. So it's very beautiful and very colorful. And I would like to, if we ever have a chance to do another one of these, those are some stories I would like to be able to share a little more about. But just culturally, it looks different, and I really want to learn a little bit more about the customs in that part of the cemetery, in that section. Just is different than other parts of the cemetery.
Well, thank you, Kate. And with that answer, that's all the time we have for today's webinar. I say this every single time we do one of our 101s. It's been a very informative lunch, and it's been great to learn new things. Also, thank you to everyone joining us today. We hope everyone will sign up for the next Iowa History 101 webinars that continue throughout the end of the year, with the next one on November 8th with Leo Landis. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and our past presentations are available on our website as well. While you're there, you can look into some of our other, I would say, fantastic digital programs, such as Goldie's Kids Club activities for historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Thank you all again for joining us today, and we hope you have a great afternoon. Have a happy Halloween, and we look forward to virtually seeing you all here again on November 8th. Thank you very much.